everybody to our January Arcadia Book Club discussion of Middlemarch by George Eliot. I don't have a book to hold up because we just sold our last copy today, and my copy is in Minnesota in my car with my son. So, oops. All right, everybody's got their copies. So, Robert Petrick is going to screen share the Venn diagram of the character map that he made that is really lovely and helpful.
It says host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Uh-oh,
So
okay.
can you enable that?
I will try to do that, yeah. Let's see, maybe that's under security.
The only thing with screen sharing is if maybe we don't screen share it the whole time, because then we won't be able to see each other when we're talking.
Agreed.
Oh.
Okay.
Me and my big mouth. Sorry.
Thanks, Adele.
Robert,
No, it's a great idea.
Well, I just was thinking, well, that would be kind of fun.
Great idea for Nancy, whose bangs are too short. Well, let's at least show it in big.
Yeah.
People can have a copy.
I'm going to put one in the chat as well.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Is there a way we can get a copy of it?
So if you download it out of the chat, then you'll have a copy of it.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you so much for doing that. That's a wonderful thing to have.
Yeah. Oh, there it is. Thanks, Robert.
Ah, you're welcome.
Yeah, you need to get it onto a full screen to really appreciate all of the little little Cupid arrows that are floating through the thing, which is quite nice. Now, I have one question. Oh no, I see. Never mind. I'm not going to say it. Okay, Nancy, do you have something else to say, Nancy?
I do not. Go ahead.
Yeah. All right. So, as I recall, a number of people have read it before. Did the people who had read it before read it again for this, or did you just refresh your memory on the Allison, for instance? Hadn't you read it twice or three times before?
Yeah, I had read it a couple times before, and I do confess that I dipped in and out of it, and but I transferred passages I had marked in an earlier edition into this edition, and every time I dipped into it, I was like, oh, I think I'll just keep reading.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one thing that I just am struck by reading this book is, having read it at different points in my life, it's real different to read it in your 20s and then in your 40s and then when you're 70. You read it in quite a different way. You know, I was very caught up in the romance when I first read it, you know. So yeah. There's probably other people who reread it too.
I would think so. Anybody else? Did people who else had read it before? And did you read it again?
Charlotte. See, this is Charlotte. I had read it probably 25 years ago in my early 50s, and now in my 70s would been the time frame. And I reread it. I remember I told Nancy that I was just absolutely despised Casaubon when I read it the first time. I was still pretty angry with him, but sort of halfway in the middle, I didn't get quite as angry with him as I had been. So that was, I don't know what accounted for that change, but.
I had that same reaction, Charlotte. I mean, I absolutely hated him the first time, and I still don't like him very much, but I had a little more compassion for him this time round.
Well, see, and I think to me, that may be the single most remarkable thing about this book, is the amount of compassion in it, and her firm commitment to not turning anyone into just an utter, straw person to knock over, or somebody to laugh at, or You know, I mean, I stopped counting the times she said, poor Mr. Casaubon. I mean, you know, because she wants to keep reminding you that this guy, you know, was just he was such an earnest, sort of sad guy, and, you know, who thought that when he got engaged, somehow some magic spell would come over him and he would be happy. And then he was distressed that the little amount of happiness that sort of flooded or didn't or trickled into his heart, as opposed to the flood that he expected. But I was just amazed by the book in that way, how she just refused to, you know, to disregard anyone. God, it's just
I'm going to have to disagree with the last three comments. Now, this was my first time reading the book, but I don't think he deserves any compassion or anything. I mean, I've never heard of somebody trying to dictate his wife's love life after he's gone, and the way he treated her and his relative and anybody else. I mean, to me, the only thing I can compare him to are all these evangelicals supporting Trump because he's such a great role model for Christianity. Sorry. It's got me worked up.
It's okay, Larry. You're behaving already with your accustomed taste and charm, so that's good. But see, I, on the other hand, Larry, I restructured my will having read Casaubon. So, Helen, who's 22 years younger than I am, is in for a big surprise.
It's all going to the dog now, James?
That was the thing that I thought when I read it. I just remember in law school what you learn in trust and estates and property laws, that because there's this great visual about that the law doesn't allow the long cold hand to come from the grave and control things. So all I could think was that wouldn't fly now, Mr. Casaubon.
Right. But remember, I think, unless I'm misremembering from all the Shaw plays I directed, that, I mean, women had no right to any property until about 1870 in England. So, and this is set in the 1830s. But yes, I agree. Yes, that was a terrible. I'm not suggesting that he's a decent person. I'm only suggesting that she's.
Oh, he just froze up.
Froze for a second, James.
Just so that I think factually, you need to understand that it was quite common for estates to go to wives so long as they did not remarry. So that as evil as it seems, and we all know his reason for his intent wasn't the same, but it was pretty common to have.
So what would have happened if she and Will had just lived together, not gotten married? Wouldn't that have worked, or would that would have been so scandalous that they couldn't get away with it, I assume?
Well, since
that would have been like George Eliot's own life, you know, living with the man who wasn't her husband, who was married to somebody else.
Well, not being clear, but having survived through a wife going through law school and passed the CPA exam law section on just the gleanings from that marriage. Common law marriage cuts in at some point, and so you're deemed married in the eyes of the law.
Mm-hmm. Well, it'll be interesting, I think, someday. I mean, we're reading, I think that George Eliot, if you take each one of the characters, I can find things not to like about each person. Even the people that she's writing about as kind of the, you know, quote unquote, good people. But we're reading, you know, kind of along this line of, you know, Larry's comment about, you know, her not being able to marry Will. And we're reading about the late 1800s. In 200 years from now, when somebody's reading about 2023, I guess I'm trying to argue that in a way, I mean, George Eliot, she did such a good job of giving you a snapshot of what was happening and what the people were thinking. And, you know, much as I didn't particularly like Casaubon. I completely understood what he was thinking and why he did what he did. And things today, I don't know why this popped into my head, are in some ways no different with marriage and divorce because I have a family member who in California got divorced. California law said that the male family member had to pay alimony until either his ex-wife died or remarried. So, if 200 years from now, you might read about that and go, well, that's completely ridiculous. By then she had a job, she was doing great, and the family all cheered when she remarried because it meant the other family member didn't have to make a payment anymore. But that, I don't know, I personally think that's as onerous as Casaubon's will.
Yeah, and I think I want to make sure, Larry, that you don't mishear what I intended to say, which was that I think she does laugh at some of these characters, and she certainly finds them. She might find them, some of their behavior despicable, but she understands them, and I think that, and she helps us to understand them, and I think that's really a great gift to us. What do you want to talk about? Do you want to talk via characters? Do you want to? I mean, who did of the three young women in the book, the three principal young women? Which one was which one did you like most, and which did you like the least? Let's that'll just get us going. But
I have things to say about Rosamond.
Oh, okay.
So I think I just finished this 2 days ago. I absolutely loved this book. It had been kind of like vaguely on my to-read list for years, and I was so happy that it was chosen because it actually made me read it. I loved it so much. And I think it's such a good point that like even unsympathetic characters like Mr. Casaubon, you could kind of see like some humanity in them that made you understand where they were coming from. I didn't like him either, but I didn't hate him. But I do think in a lot of the reviews and criticism I've read, Rosamond was so maligned by absolutely everybody. I just read in The Guardian, I could send it if people haven't seen it, a review by A.S. Byatt, who's a writer I really love, but she absolutely just had nothing nice to say about Rosamond. And I don't find her as sympathetic as someone like Dorothea, maybe, but I highlighted a lot of passages where Lydgate was kind of complaining about how Rosamond turned out to be as his wife, when I'd love to hear everyone else's opinion, but from my perspective, she at no point in their courtship had any like indication that she was not who she exactly turned out to be. She didn't mislead him. She didn't come across as someone who cared about any kind of medicinal research. She didn't come across as someone who would be just a devoted, mindless wife. And he was the one who expected that of her, didn't get it, ended up in debt, not necessarily because of her, but because of what he thought she wanted, and then blamed her for not becoming the like medical researcher he was destined to be. So I think she was like the villain of the novel who didn't deserve to be the villain of the novel.
Sort of the fall guy.
Yeah, kind of. Like she was just I was talking to my boyfriend earlier, like she was the hot blonde who everybody hates because she's the hot blonde. You know what I mean? I don't know what she looks like, but
well, she was
the kind of archetype she seemed to embody, and I just think that was really unfair. I don't think that was what George Eliot was intending, but a lot of the criticism I've read of the book kind of took that perspective, and I found that really frustrating.
Well, you know what, Kate? Rosamond was she was definitely a product, a woman of her time.
Exactly.
And
like,
she wasn't pretending to be anything else.
Yeah.
And I feel like similarly, Dorothea did the same thing with Casaubon. You know, it's sort of that
Flip side.
notion of expectations without any verification from your prospective spouse that that's the life you're going to lead. That she thought she was going to be this equal partner and learning and growing and supporting, and there was likewise to Lydgate, I think, no empirical support from Casaubon that would be the case.
Well, they were all living in they had no idea what marriage was. They just had these ideas in their head that they thought it would be.
I think I agree with you. That's the point. They were very, especially they're intended to be, and they had to have been unworldly when they got married. So they had no idea, and Dorothea, had this kind of inflated sense of how she wanted to do something crucially important, which was wonderful. But I think her journey through the book is brilliant because she was so unworldly when she started. And Kate, I do think I agree with you that a lot of people do malign the other, oh God, the names are just Rosamond out of my brain. But I read one really funny, brilliant thing about, in a criticism about that marriage, the Lydgate and Rosamond marriage, if it was built on a mirroring of self-regard. Brilliant, in their own sense. And at one point, George Eliot says about them that they just had no idea about each other's lives, when they were meeting, when they were falling in love. They had no concept of the life of the other person. But I think what's absolutely brilliant about Rosamond is chapters, chapter 81 in particular is probably I think it's one of the greatest chapters of any book I've ever read. It's when the two women come together and have their long conversation, and they each reveal these hugely important things to each other. And so, and it's reassuring. And so here's the difference, I would say, between the two women. That journey for Dorothea starts that massive, really sort of crucial, it's a step towards the biggest change that gets explored towards the end of the book. But and conversely, for Rosamond, she has this incredible sense of, discovery of what's going on inside. But when we find out in the finale that she, in relation to her husband, she kept very firmly to the way she'd behaved through the entire marriage. And I just thought that was really fascinating. But that chapter, the way it's written, the way it's constructed, and the way that the two women reveal things to each other and end up just holding, clutching at each other because the emotion has been so profound. I read the chapter twice and I just sat there thinking, oh my God, it's just insanely good.
Well, and I think, James, that you're right. It's an incredible chapter. And it lets you know that, I mean, I'm extrapolating and applying a different period of time, but we find out then in the final chapter that Rosamond and Lydgate go on to have 4 children. So I'd like to think that part of that change in her in that chapter 81 opened her up. Because if you would have asked me before, would she, after she lost the one baby, was she going to have any children with him? No, I don't think either of them were going to let each other into their beds, but something happened.
Right. No, that's great. That's a really good thought. Yeah, really good. More suggestions about the women?
So I'm going to answer your question, but I probably got started off on the wrong foot. I do want to say that I love the book. I finally have removed the stain of 10th grade English when I was forced to read Silas Marner, and I didn't even know that George Eliot was a woman. So I finally have gotten over that negative perception, and the book was wonderful. But I'm going to disagree with people. I started by really liking Rosamond and Lydgate. I thought when they fell in love, I thought, oh, thank goodness, there's one romantic couple that believes in true love, and they're going to be the one couple that's going to have a good marriage. So I liked her up until Lydgate started to have the money problems, and she was oblivious. And so right up until the scene that you described, James, where she finally stops being an idiot because Dorothea talks to her, I liked her at the beginning, greatly disliked her at the end. On the other hand, I really disliked Dorothea at the beginning because as much as I disliked Casaubon, she was so naive and so stupid about marriage and love. But by the end of the book, I really liked her because she seemed genuinely wanting to make a better community, a better world, and chose love over money. But to me, the best female character was far and away Mary Garth, because she was the only one who seemed to have principles. She wasn't ruled by ambition or the love of money, but she was willing to hold off on getting married to Fred until he got his act together, which, thanks to her father, she finally did. And I'm trying to find, there's a passage where it said they're all characters and she decided to play someone who was not mean or treacherous, since a lot of the characters were. So I really liked how my perception of the women changed throughout the book.
I think with Mary, it's because she's the only one that had like parents that really showed her a good marriage, that they were so respectful of each other. You know, Mr. Brooks was a great character, but you know, he's not a great role model for being a husband or a father. And Rosamond's parents, you know, it was all appearance. And
Yeah.
she was all of, you know, that's how she was raised, is she had to, it was all about her looks, you know, and everything. It's like her blonde hair, he was petting her feathery hair, you know, and that's all she had to trade in were her looks, or that's all that was expected of her, which, you know, was horrible, and yet that's what it was. So yeah, I think it's pretty good actually how Cicely and Dorothea actually did turn out with Mr. Brooks guiding them. I loved him. I thought he was hilarious, but you know, maybe he wasn't like the best guy to get advice from.
I saw Blake Lively playing Rosamond in the movie that should be made. But here's the quote about Mary on page 298. She had already come to take life very much as a comedy in which she had a proud, nay, a generous resolution not to act the meaner, treacherous part. And those kind of philosophical commentary throughout the book was another thing that I thought really made it a great book.
Yeah, I know that especially when it came out, there was an awful lot of criticism of that sort of godlike voice. But yeah, I think that I agree with you, Larry. I think it's those interjections are really fabulous.
Well, I will say it was her interjection and her discussion of Casaubon just before he died, where she said, now, you know, take pity on the guy. He had all this kind of stuff. And I kind of like, that's what brought me up short this time, and realized that I had been too harsh on him. And it was because of that godlike voice.
Well, that godlike voice is Eliot. I mean, that's the, you know, omniscient narrator coming in and telling us these things commenting on her characters in a way, you know.
Yeah.
Isn't there a moment where she even says, when she starts into something about Dorothea, and then after the wedding, after the marriage, and then she says, no, what am I doing? Let's get it from Casaubon's point of view. I mean, she even calls herself out in the middle of the book for saying, no, don't turn it, turn it back in for a minute. Let's, yeah, it's an amazing voice, I think. I just meant that a lot of the men critics, of the book were critical of her philosophizing, shall we say. But
just a comment about her voice. It's not really, well, it's not at all about the women characters, but just a comment about her voice. I was fascinated on the very first page of the prelude, that in the first chapter, she references Saint Teresa of Avila, who was a doctor of the Catholic Church and is a much revered saint. I felt a little kinship because, interestingly enough, about a week before I started reading Middlemarch, I started reading a biography of Saint Teresa, and so read about the whole episode about her taking her brothers where they were going to toddle off and be martyrs. And so it was kind of a weird, it was a very weird moment for me, because I went, wait, I just read about this. But it was interesting that George Eliot would pick a very highly regarded female saint to start and end her book with. And I wish I would have done a little more, like going back and rereading the beginning and the end, and kind of putting it all together, and how it related to the book. I have to admit, I didn't do that term paper, so I get an F on that assignment. But it is something that I thought a lot about.
Yeah.
Well, I would have gotten an F on an assignment in college to read this, because I couldn't even in my mid-70s get through the first 100 pages, and that was a struggle. And then once I got through that, then all of a sudden I got into the rhythm of what was going on, and then I could follow it further.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to admit, I cheated. I could not read it. I kept trying and trying and trying, and I didn't make it even to 100 pages. I didn't like any of the characters. I cheated. I got the miniseries from the library because it has Rufus Sewell in it. So I figured, okay, how bad could it be?
Wait, who does Rufus play?
Will Ladislaw.
Ladislaw.
Of course,
right? And Juliet Aubrey is Dorothea. And so I don't know how, and it was adapted by Andrew Davies. So I figured, okay, shouldn't be too bad. So, but I even struggled watching 6 hours of the DVD. So, but I made it through.
It's quite faithful to the book, but when was that series made, in the 90s or something? I mean,
1994.
Yeah, it feels very dated, when we think of it in terms of a comparable series today, I think,
Right.
Is that the only film of it?
No, I think there was another on IMDb. I think there was something else in like 2004.
Oh, really?
I think.
Wow.
So I think there are two, but this was a 6-hour BBC thing, and it was okay. I didn't love it. I didn't.
It's not nearly as good as the book. I mean, it's faithful to the book, but it's not as good as the book.
Yeah.
Not by a long shot.
Yeah.
It did prompt a huge reinterest in the book, though, when it came out, which was probably a good thing, because she'd sort of fallen out of interest and favor. And I think that series, which I've never seen, I just read that it created a kind of Middlemarch mania for a little while.
I love the book. I thought it was absolutely great, but I barely made it through the first 100 or 200 pages also. And I even left myself, the whole month of January to really slam it if I had to. And I got to the second to the last, 3 chapters short of the end, and I couldn't put it down. I had to find out what was happening. And
Yeah.
this was all gonna wrap up. And I was stunned at how beautifully she drew her characters and how she got them to interact. It was most appropriate interactions I've ever seen. And another thing, how does she know what young men go through, like the gambling thing and some of that's, I mean, how does one get that kind of insight? I mean, that's exactly how it feels. How, when you lose all your money when you're a young man and you think, well, I'm not going to gamble anymore, but that doesn't help you at the point. Yeah, I just thought it was a great book, and I'm 75 years before I even took a chance and read it. So I appreciate that it was on the list. So I also, Rosalind, I thought it was a very unkind thing for the husband to say that she was some sort of fungus that grew on the brains of men or something. I thought that was a really unkind cut. I mean, come on.
You didn't write that in the anniversary card.
On the other hand, I do think anybody who gets married or, and thinks that that's the way it's going to be is, that they're not able to cope with reality very well. And I don't think she ever picked up on it, but I'm not sure any of her elders did either. I mean, it seemed to me like all of the older women in the movie, except for Mary's mother, maybe, sort of had that part to play, and that's what they did, and that's what they expected. So maybe she was going on that, but it seemed kind of strange to me that she didn't change. I mean, you have to change or you don't make it. So
I'd like to, I wondered if,
No, go ahead.
well, I just wondered if people could discuss a little bit more the marriages of the other people, because I'm not sure that I was wondering exactly about that question, how the marriages of the older parents fed and what they were saying about the issue of marriage. And I did kind of think to myself that the Vinceys, even though I agree with Nancy that what they prized in their daughter was her beauty and the superficial things, and the mother liked all the superficial things, there seemed to be several moments in which Fred and, I forget her name, Rosamond's parents had, were caring for each other. And then Bulstrode and his wife, I mean, at the end, she just really came through like a trooper, and he appreciated it. So I thought so I'm interested to hear what people's reflections of those older marriages that had gone on for 20 and 30 years compared to now these young people starting out in marriage.
The Vinci's just reminded me of a political couple, that he's the mayor and his wife, and it just seemed as though they had joined forces in a lot of ways, and their kids were part of this this picture that they're painting. So that, I know that's just one piece probably of their marriage, but that resonated as a familiar trope sort of to me.
I'm going to shut up, but I thought Harriet Bulstrode, when Bulstrode got into all of his deserved trouble at the end of the book, I thought that the way Eliot gave us what was going on inside her while she was still being supportive, quote unquote, of her husband, that how much that something crucial had died inside her. I thought that was really beautiful and very moving. And you could feel, and she then writes later that Bulstrode was, sort of lived in fear of his wife suddenly. I mean, that there was a fear of her being, unleashing whatever he's subconsciously feeling, she must be feeling. I thought that was really startling and powerful. Yeah, the Vinci, they're quite the couple. But even so, I mean, they're decent people, and his relationship to his sister, who's married to Bulstrode, was very moving. I thought he was very supportive of her, and I loved the way that Eliot wrote him. His device of saying at the end of everything, and just kind of being a bit stumbly and fumbly verbally, and then she would quietly let someone else in the community make a kind of offhand comment about how odd he was. Another thing I read in one criticism was, I got to find this because it's so great. Somebody else talk, I'll find it in my notes here. Oh, I know, I got it. A world in which people knew their neighbors well enough to come to the wrong conclusions about them.
Adele, what were you going to say?
Well, James just led right into it. Yeah, all the relationships I remembered from the time I read it before. And I didn't get it all read because I really enjoyed the footnotes. And I kept going back and forth, and it really helped to understand some of the terms and the phraseology of some of the things. And they were hysterical. And that when I read the introduction, it talked about that Middlemarch was almost like a social comedy. And so I thought, okay, I'm gonna check that side of Middlemarch out, the funny side of it. And there were hysterical scenes with Mrs. Garth in the kitchen with the boys, and the one son wouldn't pay attention. And the one clergy wife who just kept saying, oh, well, he's about to put one foot in the grave. And she says, well, he better pull out the other one then. And just there were really clever, funny stuff. And all the experiments that Lydgate and the other clergy were having. I know. Anyway, so I didn't finish the book, but I read a lot of, I really read it. I mean, like word for word. And I also enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed the comedy.
Yeah, I'd like to say one thing about Adele's point. This book was so funny. It was so much funnier than I was expecting it to be. I mean, I grew up with Jane Austen, who I think is hilarious, but even at the very beginning, I started reading this online, like on my ebook, so I didn't highlight it, but there was something in the beginning where when Casaubon was engaged to Dorothea and Mrs. Cadwallader was talking about him and said, oh, there's not an ounce of red blood running in his veins. If you cut him open, it's just semicolons and like quotation marks or something. That was hilarious. Yeah. She's so like cutting in such a subtle way.
Yeah, that was hilarious. Yeah,
it's such a funny book, honestly. But one of the other things, it wasn't one of the married couples, but I think like one of the pointedly not married people, Mr. Fairbrother, was such the scene where he was talking to Fred outside of the gambling hall, whatever it would be called, where he's like, the girl I'm in love with is in love with you, you better get your shit together. Sorry, but that scene was absolutely heartbreaking. That was so beautiful. I think I know this is a book that's like often, I say often like I'm an expert, but talked about as a portrait of marriage. But I think also just his role in it as someone who remains unmarried for a reason, not because he doesn't have someone he's in love with, but someone who he's in love with who he can't be with. That his non-relationship was one of those poignant parts of the book, I thought.
I agree. Yeah, he's a really fascinating character in the way. And one thing about the there's a kind of snobbery there's a very clear snobbery in the book that goes through many sequences, but the thing you just quoted about there isn't anything in him, but I mean, that's also, that's a kind of snobbish view that he's not an appropriate person to marry. And I think that's the way she dealt with class and snobbery and social standing was, frequently funny, but always on the mark. And oh, and by the way, Larry, you said this about 20 minutes ago, but yeah, I love Mary Garth too. I thought Mary Garth was just, she's just so straightforward and just kind of takes life as it is, and that's great. And the way she doesn't she say something at the end about how her dad says to her, "Wouldn't you have rather had the Reverend?" Or maybe she's talking to Fred about the Reverend, and she says, "Well, and Fred says he's 10 times more better, and she says, "Well, that's why he doesn't need to be married to me, because he's 10 times better than I am." And you and I are equals, and we're the ones who ought to be married. And because there was a moment in the book when I did feel like, oh, she really ought to marry Fairbrother. He's such a decent, wonderful guy, and he obviously cares about her. But then when she said that at the end, I thought, of course, right, that makes perfect sense. They match, Mary and Fred, and they've known each other forever. And so she knew what she wanted when she was 6, and she held out until she got the man she wanted. Really great, really great.
I think Fairbrother is the Rick from Casablanca character. He gives up the woman he loves for the betterment of the community. But I want to go back to what Diane, Allen, somebody else said. I struggled with the first 100 or 200 pages, and it reminded me of way back when I was in college taking a Shakespeare class. And at first I was really struggling, but at some point during that semester, all of a sudden Shakespeare started to make sense. And I had the same experience as Al, as I was only getting through like 50 pages at a time. And then all of a sudden, about halfway or 2/3 through, it just like took off, and is like all of a sudden it made sense. So Diane, I think if you ever decide to tackle it, you'd be surprised. But I want to share my favorite chapter was 71, when the scandal was discovered. And I just thought it was so reminiscent of today when things go viral. But obviously, there's no technology yet. Within a day or two, the entire town, everybody talks to someone who talks to someone who talks to someone. And on page 677, I thought this was so relevant today, with people believing conspiracies instead of facts. But this vague conviction of interminable guilt, which was enough to keep up much head shaking and biting innuendo, even among substantial professional seniors, had for the general mind all the superior power of mystery over fact. Everybody liked better to conjecture how the thing was than simply to know it, for conjecture soon became more confident than knowledge, and had a more liberal allowance for the incompatible. I just thought that it was like, we think this is a new thing, the way rumors and conspiracies and people don't believe in facts, but here it is. My only disappointment in the book as a Jewish person was to see the anti-Semitism that came up 3 or 4 times. And I'm sure that was a reflection of the times, but with what's going on today, that was sad to me, that was in there as kind of a matter of fact.
No, that makes sense, and I think you're right. I mean, it was just a part of somebody, of many people's, just the way they saw the world Same page, Larry, was it 677? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah, 675, 677. At the top of 677, I wrote on the book Fox News. And that was, so
Exactly.
Robert, you're allowed to speak, even though you're so if you have something you say.
Actually, yeah, just a couple of responses to some of the things people have been saying. In terms of sort of the ramp up into this book, I had the same issue, but it had nothing to do with the story or the characters. It was all, for me, it was just about the Victorian language. And I think that's sort of like the Shakespeare analogy, right? Anytime I read anything that was written in the mid to late 19th century, I have that same issue. It's just a matter of sort of getting familiar with the tongue, if you will, right? So once you get that, then it really starts to read smoothly. One of I love this book. I read this book last summer, and hearing you all talk about it makes me wish that I read it again this past month, so it was a little more fresh in my mind. But I did have to sort of draw a map as I read it because I was getting so confused in terms of who owned which estate and where, who belonged to who in terms of the various generations. So I actually drew a map as I was reading it, which ultimately became really helpful to me. But one of the things I love the book. One of the things I really love about it, and I think is part of Eliot's genius, is that the people are sort of put on the page, and I'm thinking in terms of morality, and how everybody falls somewhere on the spectrum of morality, but many people, very few of them are fixed. Many of them are moving back and forth on that spectrum. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, Eliot does that, number one, to show the human condition, right? How everybody can contain multitudes. And in fact, these people do. But when I view it through morality, for instance, I'll go back to the conversation about Dorothea and Rosamond. I felt in the very beginning, their intention in terms of getting married, the morality behind their intention was so different. And that's why I disliked Rosamond from the beginning, because I thought that her intention towards marriage was, strictly material and money driven. And whereas I felt like Dorothea was much more virtuous. So from the beginning, I had that sort of polar opposite feeling about the two of them. But that's just another way to think about all of these characters, is where they fall on that spectrum and how often they bounce back and forth.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Nobody has mentioned Celia yet. And I was just thinking, because I was looking at my notes, and one of the things I loved Celia, and the fact that she called her sister Dodo the whole book, I just adored, because it, again, so many things in the book just keep humanizing everybody. And I just thought that was so great. But there's one point where Dodo says to Celia, one is constantly wondering what sort of lives other people lead and how they take things. And you sort of feel like that's the whole book in that one sentence. That's kind of what Eliot just did. She created this, and you look at Robert's map, this web of people's lives, and she just keeps exposing more and more of them as we go. But Celia, I just thought, Celia knew that her husband was in love with her sister first. Didn't matter at all. She has the baby, and now the baby's become the Buddha. The way she treated the baby and expected everybody to think this baby was a miracle. It just made me laugh out loud. And yet she was so good with her sister all the time, and the way that they loved each other unconditionally. no matter how frustrated they were with each other. It was just so moving to me. Really.
How about that Dorothea couldn't move out of the house because she'd missed the baby's bath time, and it would be a sin to miss how wonderful the baby's bath time was. It was like, you're a tad self-involved.
But you know what? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that, I mean, it is a little self-involved, but when you're a brand new mom, it's kind of real. I mean, it feels very, I mean, at first I read it going, oh, for God's sake. And then I went, no, wait a moment. I mean, I'm not sure I ever made any of my friends stay to watch me give a bath to my children, but it's, you know, it's this baby and it's yours, and everything he or she does is special, and you want everyone to share. And certainly she'd want her sister to be part of that. So while kind of goofy, it made sense.
Parent sits and stares at the baby sleeping. You know, that's how it is.
And particularly because it was just those two sisters for so long. I thought that was an interesting that you just didn't read at some point that they didn't have any backstory, that, you know, they lost their parents early, but there wasn't much more than that. And so it made sense to me, and I thought it was really beautiful too. I did love how I thought Celia probably seemed like one of the most Jane Austen characters. She just seemed she was just so always herself, but that relationship between the two of them was really lovely. It led me to what James was talking about. I just kept thinking, because I think about this so much in life, but I kept coming back to this question of what combination of familial opportunity, personal circumstances, and individual traits and social structures of the time forge the direction that each person goes in. Yeah. I think about that so much with respect to everybody in my life and my kids and so many friends and family this was such a case study of that. You just could imagine how you could extrapolate, as Mary Pat said earlier, and just kind of investigate endlessly. Well, with 800 pages, I guess that's not surprising.
Well, but you're absolutely right. And the sense of community, and how both a family and a community shape who you are, you know, in addition to the events that happen to you in your own life, you know, I mean,
the time in which you're born. Yeah.
And so those things are just so tightly woven in this story. It's really unbelievable.
In a way, it kind of reminded me of my favorite book of all time, Little Women, which, you know, written roughly the same time period. I think Little Women was written first. You know, it so much reminded me of it, except that Eliot kind of made her book 4 times longer and a lot more exposition, but you know, the same similar kind of people and feelings and family.
And I thought too, the community aspect that was recently mentioned, what just came out so much. You saw this community of the Midlands in England as they were beginning to develop manufacturing and greater economy, and what changes were going on by that. And maybe Robert could reflect on it. Maybe he'd do this drawing. But I kept thinking of that painting, The Night Watchman of Amsterdam, The Night Watchman, which were all the burghers and businessmen of Amsterdam. And I kept thinking that picture in mind as all these characters would come in. And particularly the scene during the reading of the will, and then the other one when they were all talking about the scandal that had just broken forth. There were so many people, and you just fill up a painting with all those people. And I thought the other interesting thing was that Eliot described all of these individuals. I don't know how many characters, Robert, did you come up with? But if you go back to the book, I bet you'll find that there was a physical description, maybe only a couple words of each of them.
Right. Well, and just to piggyback on that one statement about this incredible scene of the will, and then the gossiping that Larry brought. I mean, people loved it. They love that. You know, they want it. They want to know what's going on with their neighbors. You know, that's part of being in a community. Is having an opinion about everybody's behavior. They sort of relish when somebody does something bad. It's just and apropos of what you said, Mary Pat, to defend Celia's baby, you know, the woman who wrote the foreword to this version of Middlemarch, Rebecca Mead, who also wrote the book My Life in Middlemarch. She has in a letter that she wrote to a friend after she had her baby. She's saying to her friend, you know, all my life, I first read Middlemarch and when I was 17, and now I'm 36, and I was always Dorothea, and I've now had a daughter, and after 15 minutes, I became Celia.
Oh, that's funny. Well, you know, I tried to imagine every once in a while when I was reading, and you know, Adele, more power to you for reading every single word. I did read the book, but I would be lying if I said I read every single word. But I tried to imagine what it would have been like when she wrote it, and it came out in 8 different installments. Is that correct?
Yes.
I think 8. And so, you know, going, okay, 100 pages and then another 100. And was it once a month? I don't know that. But thinking, you know, back then it would have been, and where did she actually make the break? It would have been like, well, not even for us now, right? Because we can watch anything when we want and binge the whole series. But before that, and all of us on the call are, you know, of an age where we can remember, you know, episode 1 on Sunday, and then you had to wait till next Sunday. And I can see, as I thought about this book, I thought I could definitely see where these installments, I would be waiting for the next one and waiting to find out what happened, who did what, or maybe she left people hanging with all the gossip, and then you went, oh, but what really happened? So I'm sure it was a very powerful story to read.
Well, and many books were done that way. I mean, a lot of Dickens novels came out in serial form, you know, so very common practice then. Well, remember what Aaron Sorkin did at the end of the first season of West Wing. You know, you think the president, you have to spend the whole summer to find out the president survived at the end of the first season of West Wing. I mean, come on. Oh, what time is it? Oh gosh. Okay. I had one little tiny thing I wanted to read, but I have to say that I feel like the last 2 paragraphs of this book are among the 10 greatest paragraphs ever written in the English language. I mean, they're just absolutely unbelievable to have, you know, to have those thoughts, you know, after this long thing with all of these complicated people, to end the way she ended it, just unbelievable. But I do have one little thing to read because I kept going back and reading it over and over again. It's on page 186 of the blue Middlemarch, the most, but it's about when Dorothea is kind of unhappy in her, you know, at the early part of her marriage. And at one point, Eliot, right, this is when she's been crying for 6 weeks. 6 weeks after her wedding, she was crying. And she writes, some discouragement, some faintness of heart at the new real future, which replaces the imaginary, is not so unusual. And we do not expect people to be deeply moved by what is not unusual. that element of tragedy which lies in the very fact of frequency has not yet wrought itself into the coarse emotion of mankind, and perhaps our frames could hardly bear much of it. If we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heartbeat, and we should die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence. As it is, the quickest of us walk about well wadded with stupidity. And it's the same, you know, Thornwilder did the same thing in Act 3 of Our Town, you know, in the sense if we had any clue of what was really going on, you know, it's just, life is both so wonderful and so unbearable that it's just great. And I think she gets that balance over and over again in the book. It's really something. God.
Glad you read that passage, James. That's one of my very favorites in the book. That and the last two paragraphs at the end. They're just gorgeous. Really gorgeous.
Thank you. Yeah.
What chapter is that in? If our editions don't match the page number.
Chapter 20.
20?
Yeah.
20, yeah.
Thanks.
That was one that I underlined too. It was one of my favorite ones.
Yeah.
Somebody said about reading every word, but you can see from this book that there's a lot of little places I'm marking. I'll just arbitrarily open it to 2 pages, and it's you know, it's, I can't. I'm an inveterate scribbler in books, and it's always fun to go back and think, oh God, really? Why did I underline that? But this book, I remember being in Unabridged bookstore in Chicago, and my dear friend Ed, who owns Unabridged, we were talking about, we both do that in books, and he was talking about Julian Barnes's sense of an ending. And he said, you know, just like you, he said, I know you keep a day book and you write things in your day book. He said, I thought with sense of an ending, I was just going to dip it in yellow. Dip the whole book in yellow. So anyway, I think I could do that with this book. My terrible sadness is that I did not read this when I was 20, because I know I would have read it once a decade for sure. So now I have to live to be 125 so that I can read it 5 more times. Oh God, what a horrifying thought. Not the reading bit. The reading bit's great. Living to be 125, Jesus. Oh my God.
James, has it ever been adapted to the stage?
You know, Larry, I think there should be a moratorium on adapting these 19th century I see one more shitty Jane Austen adaptation, which, you know, every single scene change takes 40 minutes. You know, you just want to cut your arm off while you're watching it. No, thank you. That was sort of a no, Larry, but it was
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say thank you, Nancy and James, for putting this on our list. It was always a book I thought I should read, and I'm guessing I probably never would have picked it up. So thank you.
Thank you. And
it was a pleasure.
We talked about it a couple of years ago. We picked it up. We must have the Penguin Classic. And it's like, oh, this print is too small. So we got the beautiful green version, and it was way better.
This is a nice edition of it. It was very pleasurable to read this one.
Yeah,
because I read others that were like the Penguin, you know, with the miniature. You need a magnifying glass for the writing.
You can thank Robert for that. He pointed it out to me last summer. He said, "Look how beautiful this version is. This edition is."
It is beautiful.
So if you haven't had enough, in addition to the Rebecca Mead, there's Middlemarch and the Imperfect Life by Pamela Aarons, which gets a blurb from Rebecca Mead. So these are essays.
Yeah.
And Rebecca's is considered a memoir.
Yeah. And then this, which I know that Allison bought last summer from at the store. She was the only person who did, I might add. But see, I love that. I order books all the time, but it's just one person buys it. I think, yeah, okay, good. This is great. But it's The Marriage Question, and it's a book examining George Eliot's private life, her double life. It's by Claire Carlyle. And I have not read it. I just got it, but I stole it from the store before I left. But did you get a chance to read it, Allison, or have you read it yet?
Shame to say I haven't read it yet. I ambitiously thought when we knew we were going to read this, I'll read this and I'll read that book, but I opted to spend more time with Middlemarch. So yet to be done.
Can someone tell me if during her life, did people know that George Eliot was a woman, or was it a secret?
No,
It
she
wasn't.
She blew her own cover almost immediately because some guy, surprise, surprise, tried to take credit for writing the book of short stories that she published. So
well, it reminded me when years ago at an English teacher conference, I saw S.E. Hinton, and the reason she published as S.E. Hinton because she knew if she published as Susan Hinton, that boys wouldn't read her book. So
right.
That's why she used her initials, and that's probably a key to her popularity.
Right. Oh, and Al, I have to say one thing that I was in the store one day in December, and Nancy came up to me and she said, "Remember how you felt like Al was resistant about Middlemarch? He came in yesterday and he was dancing. He was so excited about the book."
Yeah, I was, yeah.
That really made me feel good. So thank you all. I feel like, you could talk about this book for months, frankly. I mean, it's one of those books you could just dive into, but it's anyway, it was great. I'm glad that we did it, and I know it was a challenge, but it was really worth it. Ooh, wow.
Yeah.
Robert, thanks for the map. Everybody I think the map.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, and as a reward for getting through 800 pages, we've chosen Orbital.
Cool.
Look how slim this one is. So James wrote about this one in this week's newsletter.
Less than 200 pages, ladies and gentlemen. You could read it 4 times.
But James says we will have just as much to talk about with this one. So we'll talk about Orbital by Samantha Harvey on February 21st.
Okay, so I think I'm just going to spend the whole year reading George Eliot and about George Eliot. I'm retiring from public life. I'm going to become a monk of the Eliot clan.
Someone told me that her first book was one of her best. Adam Bede. Yeah. What is another book of hers that people would recommend?
I wouldn't necessarily recommend the George Eliot, but I've just moved to Manchester like a few weeks ago, and I've started reading this one, North and South. It's shorter.
I couldn't hear you. What is it?
North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. It's about a northern town that's basically a cipher for Manchester. I think if you liked Middlemarch, but you wanted something half the size and a bit sexier, this would be the book. My not brother-in-law, my boyfriend's brother recommended this one as it's got the same kind of like social engagement as George Eliot's novels do, but a little bit more about the gender issues. It's a little bit more concise, a little bit more snappy, I guess, for lack of a better word. I'm really, really enjoying it. I would recommend it.
I have a question for Larry. When I was doing a little bit of reviewing, looking online for things about the book Middlemarch, somebody said that this was recommended for 7th to 12th graders. Now, like Larry, I read Silas Marner in high school, and it was a good thing that at our age in high school, we weren't subject to as much anxiety and depression as the kids are today, because all I remember about Silas Marner is being how depressing the book was. But so then with that in mind, I was stunned that people would say that Middlemarch was a 7th to 12th grade book. And so
no, it's definitely not a middle school book. It would have to be a AP high school class. I would say otherwise. I wish I had read it in college, because I would have loved to have a professor and TA and other fellow students, but no, I can't imagine. I was excited when middle schoolers read Stephen King because his books were the longest books that they would read at the time.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, we will see you on the 21st of February for Orbital.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everybody.